In February 1891, a murder in the Whitechapel district of London sent shockwaves through the community. Why people were so afraid was that they feared the return of the infamous Jack the Ripper. Frances Coles had lived in the area for some time, was well known, and lived in lodgings at 8 White's Row. Her body had been found under railway arches in the early hours of Friday 13th February. In the early hours of that morning, Frances had been in the company of Ellen Calloran. The pair had walked up Commercial Street, having been in the White Hart at George Yard, when they met a man wearing a sailor suit, a pea jacket, and cheese-cutter hat. He had allegedly accosted her and offered her £50, but when she refused, not liking the look of him, he gave her a black eye. He turned his attention to Frances. Ellen advised her against going with him and left, but she watched them as they made their way down Commercial Street in the direction of Leman Street. At 5 o'clock on the Friday morning, she heard about the murder and immediately said she believed it was Frances. She went to the police, telling them her suspicions, and they proceeded to take her to the mortuary, where she identified her friend. During police investigations, it was found that Frances had been drinking in the early hours of the Friday morning at a public house near Royal Mint Street, where she was overheard saying she had to go as she'd arranged to meet someone at the arch near the schools. An employee of the Great Northern Railway Company also noticed a woman in the company of a man near St Mary's Schools at about 12:30. She was seen again around 2 o'clock in Royal Mint Street, and according to another witness, in Chambers Street near the schools. A man was with her. The men who saw her were William Friday, Joseph Knapton and John Knapton, all railway shunters who lived in the same house in Chambers Street. Joseph had told his mother they looked like they were sweethearting. However, the description of the man she was with was vague, only being able to tell police he was wearing a brown overcoat and a black felt hat. He also said he was around 5 feet 7 inches tall. According to police and the surgeons, Frances had gone willingly with the man to Swallows Gardens. They had walked under the archway when the man stopped. At the inquest, which was held at the Working Lads Institute before East London Coroner Win Baxter, the post-mortem, carried out by Divisional Surgeon George Phillips, was read out. It was believed the perpetrator had placed his right hand over the woman's mouth while she was on the ground. He'd pulled her head back onto his chest and used a knife that he had in his other hand to cut her throat. The first wound was pretty much superficial, but the second was deep, swift, and fatal. Her death was quick. When her body was discovered by Police Constable Ernest Thompson, Frances had a second hat found crushed under her arm. The constable placed a cross on the wall showing where she'd been found. She was still warm and moved before succumbing to her injuries. He blew his whistle for assistance, and soon PCs Hyde and Hinton arrived at the scene. Soon Whitechapel was in fear as the news spread that the Ripper was back. By 5 o'clock, Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson arrived and took charge of the case. He gave orders that a sample of blood be taken before the scene was cleaned up. Among others of note to see the site of the murder were Melville McNaughton, the Chief Constable of CID, and Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner of CID. All three had been involved in the Whitechapel murders of 1888. On the Saturday, a man was arrested, and he'd been seen in the woman's company shortly before she was discovered. That man was 50-year-old James Thomas Sadler, a fireman on board the Fez steamship which had arrived on the Wednesday from Turkey and was docked at St Catherine's Dock. He was married with 3 children, but his wife later stated he had a violent temper and was a drunkard. At the time of his arrest, he was living at the Victoria Lodging House in Upper East Smithfield. When charged on Monday the 16th with murder by Detective Inspector Moore of CID, although some sources say the 17th, he vehemently protested his innocence. A knife which he owned was traced, as he stated he'd sold it to another sailor, Duncan Campbell, who was staying at the sailor's house in Welsh Street on the Friday morning. Campbell had noticed blood on it before he washed it, and sold it to another seaman, where police recovered it. He was adamant that it was Sadler who sold it to him, but Sadler denied ever owning such a knife. Sadler explained to police his movements during the period in question and said he knew Frances for a while. They had gone for a drink on the Wednesday, then went to lodgings in Dorset Street, where they stayed all night. They spent much of Thursday together, drinking, and she asked him for money for a hat. He gave her £50, and she duly bought a black crepe hat for just shy of 2 shillings. They walked round the area and ended up in Thrall Street, where they went to a common lodging house, but only stayed for a short time, as Frances wanted to get back to Dorset Street. While in Thrall Street, the pair had an argument, and a woman had struck him over the head with something that caused him to become unconscious. He showed the police officers the nasty wound, from which blood had poured onto his clothing. He said they had quarrelled, as she'd not protected him, and he took off, making his way back to the docks. This was sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock that night. When he reached the docks to get back onto his ship, the gatekeeper refused him entry due to him being so inebriated. One thing in Sadler's favour was that when he was arrested, it was noted he was wearing heavy boots that were noisy when he walked. When he was taken to the morgue, he immediately identified Frances. When Sadler appeared before Mr. Mead at the Thames Police Court, a large crowd had gathered to see him, but were disappointed. He was brought from Neiman Street under the cover of darkness, just after midnight. Police Constable Westley told the court he'd seen Sadler before 2 o'clock on the Friday morning, near the scene of the murder, with a cut above his eye. He told the officer he'd been knocked down at the dock gates, and he noted he was drunk. He checked him for broken ribs and, thinking he may have some, offered to take him to hospital, but after Police Constable Hyde checked him, he thought he was okay. Shortly before 5 o'clock, he entered the London hospital. When he spoke to the porter, William Fewell, he told him he'd been with a woman and she'd done him in. When pressed, Sadler said she'd taken 7 or 8 shillings. The porter also noticed blood on his hands and asked if he was hurt. Sadler lifted his hands, looked at them, and replied that his finger was cut. He said she or they had a knife. The porter thought the amount of blood for the small cut was too much, and that was when Sadler told him about his head wound. He dressed the wound and let him sleep for a short time. Then he left, giving the porter a penny. During the hearing, Sadler complained that he was cold and hungry and didn't feel fit enough for the proceedings. The case was continued until the following week. That day, Charles Matthews, barrister for the prosecution, was allowed to examine the witnesses. One of these was James William Coles of the Bermondsey Workhouse. He was Frances's father and told the court his daughter was 26 and that he'd last seen her on 6th February. Lorenzo Hawkes deponed that Francis had visited his mother's shop at Bethnal Green on the Thursday night, where she'd purchased a hat. Sadler looked on through the window, and the pair had walked off after the sale. Another witness, 34-year-old Charles Quiver or Guyver, the watchman at the lodging house, corroborated that Sadler had been with Francis on the Wednesday and Thursday. On the Thursday night, he told the police, Sadler had told him he'd been robbed in Thrall Street of 3 shillings and 6pence. His face was covered in blood, and he advised him to go to the yard to wash it off. He accompanied him and helped him clean up. He said it looked as if he'd been thrown down and got gravel in his face. His face was dirty and his clothes dusty, as though he'd been in a fight. He noted there was no blood on his clothes. Both of them were drunk, and Sadler couldn't rouse Frances from her slumber in the kitchen. He then left, and when she woke up, she too left around 1:30 or 1:45 a.m. At 3 a.m, Sadler returned to the house, but Mrs. Fleming, the landlady, refused him entry into the kitchen. She said he was so intoxicated he could barely stand, couldn't walk straight, and couldn't talk properly. She noticed the blood pouring down his face, and his clothes were dirty and disarranged. He said he felt faint and told her he'd been knocked down. Quiver, or Guyver, was the one who turned him out of the house. Francis was buried in the East London Cemetery on Wednesday 18th February, within a few yards of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride and Mary Jane Kelly, all victims of Jack the Ripper. Nearby was also the grave of an unknown woman whose dismembered body was found in Pinchin Street in the autumn of 1889. A huge crowd of a reported 20,000 people gathered in the cemetery, and after the mourners had left, the crowd rushed forward to glance in the grave of the unfortunate woman. It was a horrific scene. She was survived by her father and her sister, Mary Ann. In the end, there wasn't enough evidence against Sadler. The inquest jury returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown, although added the police were right to detain Sadler. According to Dr. Oxley, who'd been called to the crime scene and pronounced Frances dead, said he felt it hugely unlikely that an intoxicated drunk man could have killed her. He stated that in his opinion, Sadler was physically incapable of committing the crime. On 3rd March, Sadler appeared at the Thames Police Court. Charles Matthews, on behalf of the prosecution, stated he didn't propose upon the materials at present in our possession to proceed further with this prosecution. Sadler was then discharged and left the dock, but he remained at the prison for some time to avoid any demonstration by the crowd that had gathered outside the court, before leaving in a cab with his solicitor, Mr. Lawless of Messrs. Wilson and Wallace. No motive for the murder has ever been established. To this day, the murder of Francis Coles remains unsolved.